Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. So a few months ago, I was invited to participate in the Canadian government's AI Strategy Task Force. Of the nearly 30 people on the team, I was one of only 4 who were focused on safety. Everyone else was there to figure out how we could scale our companies, or attract better talent, or build out our infrastructure. In Canada, as with much of the world, it feels like a consensus is starting to emerge. We're going all in on AI, and regulation will only slow us down. That thinking seemed to reach an apex in December, when Donald Trump signed an executive order effectively banning AI regulation at the state level. It's hard to overstate how quickly this shift happened. Just a few years ago, even Elon Musk was calling for an industry-wide pause on AI development. And the Biden administration was developing something they called an AI Bill of Rights. The person behind that Biden initiative was Dr. Alondra Nelson. Perhaps unsurprisingly, she no longer works for the United States government. She's now the head of the Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And she was a member of Zohran Mamdani's transition team when he became the new mayor of New York. Dr. Nelson's Bill of Rights is one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive approaches to AI regulation that I've ever seen. But it's an approach that, in much of the world, is simply no longer in vogue. So I wanted to ask her, how do we make a technology safe when nobody seems particularly interested in regulating it? And what might happen if we don't? Alondra Nelson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Taylor. Great to be with you.
So you spent years working on various forms of AI regulation with the Biden administration and before, all leading up to, as I mentioned, an AI Bill of Rights. And then in December, Trump signs this pretty radical executive order. How did you react when you heard that news?
I think differently from the general public. I mean, when you work in government, I worked in the Biden administration for the first 2 and almost 2.5 years. You know that executive orders get rescinded, that new administrations come in. And so there's an expectation that a new administration is going to wind things down. So I didn't have a kind of clutch pearls shock response to it. I did think it was, and continue to think it was, very misguided and unfortunate, because we've only seen since the November 2022 adoption of ChatGPT more diffusion of these technologies, increased capability of these technologies, and growing concern about these technologies. And so, I think what we were trying to do in the Biden administration was to say, to the extent that there are good things waiting around the bend through some uses of AI technologies, you don't get there by just sort of yanking people and saying, go there, that we have got to sort of communicate to the public and create sort of guardrails, conversations, norms, expectations to do that. So the message was that we don't need any regulation around AI, and that, if you have concerns about it, you should just get over it, and we're moving along. And one understands, in part, why that's the case. They have really, in part, bet the entire U.S. economy on getting this right. So it's important for all sorts of reasons that American, equities in AI advance. But it's coming at a tremendous cost: the cost of young people's mental health, the cost of people's lives and livelihoods, the cost of people's trust in government, the cost of sexual imagery, scams, fraud, and other concerns.
Yeah. So it seemed like that order had sort of twin effects. One was a signal, as you mentioned, that we're going to let this technology run and we're not going to step in the way, and we're going to put gas on it, essentially. But it also was meant to dissuade state action or friction coming from the states. Has that had an effect? Like, what's going on at the state level in response to that?
I think that the United States has this kind of strong sense of federalism, and that is a strong sense across the states, whether or not they're quote unquote blue states or red states. So, I think the response from governors and from attorneys general, whether you're talking about Utah or Colorado or California or Texas or Florida, has been this falls to us. We have constituencies that are very concerned about the use of these technologies, and it's our responsibility to do something about it because the federal government's not going to do something about it.
So just to close the loop on this order, because I find it quite bizarre, but does it actually have power? Like, can he actually stop California and Florida, of all places, from doing this?
Yeah, so the stick, right? With carrots and sticks, the sticks with the executive order was a policy called BEAD, which is federal funding that goes to states to help them to build out their broadband and digital infrastructure. So it's basically saying, sure, you can go ahead, have your federalism, but you're not going to get your broadband.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. You wrote a really interesting article in Science recently where you kind of counterintuitively argued that Trump's approach actually isn't hands-off and deregulating, that he's actually trying to shape via the government the AI sector in almost an unprecedented way. What did you mean by that? Can you walk us through that argument?
Sure. I mean, I think, Taylor, kind of where we began, there's been this sort of sense, this mirage, as I call it in the piece, that Trump administration AI policy has been, the phrases that are used, light touch, hands off, and deregulatory in a more formal sense. And I think that we've taken up that framework, and partly because it's been cast as an opposition to the prior administration. So it's like, the Biden-Harris administration was so regulatory and so, ham-fisted and hands-on. And we are, as one of the saying goes, just let them cook. The tech companies, the VCs, let them cook,
Let it rip.
But what turns out to be true, if you get beyond the bluster, which is the case often with politics, is that the Trump administration is actually doing quite a lot of heavy-handed AI policy and AI governance. And it is not deregulatory. It includes things like tariffs that we can talk about that, sort of tariffs that are being used not just to balance trade, but also as bargaining chips in conversations about critical minerals and rare earths, for example. In the piece, I also talk about other things. I mean, the Trump administration has gone after Silicon Valley workers and H-1B visas, which are visas for highly skilled workers. Right now, there is, a policy in place. I'm not sure if it's to the extent to which it's being implemented, which says if you want to bring foreign workers to the United States, like on an H-1B visa, which is a lot of the workforce that in places like Silicon Valley, that those visas cost $100,000 each, which is real money if you're talking about a company with dozens, scores, hundreds of employees who are coming from abroad. And then, of course, if you followed what was happening in the federal science and technology research ecosystem, the policies that were saying you can't fund this kind of research or you should fund this kind of research were steering very strongly in the direction of certain kinds of AI science. So all of that taken together across research, immigration flows, people, talent, American taxpayers have the largest stakeholder stake in Intel, which is a chips company. So all of that, all told, is actually quite a expansive and comprehensive governance of AI from the Trump administration.
I mean, imagine if your previous boss had started buying pieces of American tech companies. The reaction would have been quite different, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but there's a different philosophy, right? So the Biden administration did have an arrangement with Intel, but it was a subsidy that would be paid to Intel, after certain kind of benchmarks had been met, and including union labor and other sorts of things. So, yeah.
So the message that much of the rest of the world have taken from this is to step back from a broad regulatory approach, right? In terms of like formal regulatory and safety measures. And the term light touch you hear all the time, like you mentioned. And certainly our AI minister uses that all the time. So why do you think there's been this spillover effect of a change in US posture to essentially a change in posture across the Western democratic world?
So, I think you don't have to be a political economist to say in short response to your question, Taylor, follow the money. I mean, I think that, any growth that the US has had, economic growth has come from a few tech companies driven by AI. And I think so goes the US, so goes the world. I mean, there are kind of ripple effects to all of these market effects. And so I think that's partly it. I do think, and partly why I wrote this piece in Science, The Mirage of AI Deregulation, was because I think that people started to believe that the reason that NVIDIA valuations are increasing, our Meta valuations are increasing, was because of something called deregulation, when in fact it was this kind of heavy-handed steering that I was saying to you that the Trump administration has been doing, which in some instances lets companies do whatever they want, but in other instances does not. And so it is not just sort of let it run free. It's really picking winners and losers in the marketplace. So I think it's fully rational for colleagues in the EU, colleagues in Canada, to look at what's happening with these market valuations and sort of make a calculation about at least pausing regulation, if not stalling it for the time being.
I mean, another layer of this is not just the getting on the bandwagon of the potential growth and productivity boost that could come from this sector, but it also is a response to sort of overt threats from the US. And
yes.
I think the moment this really came into view was J.D. Vance's speech at the Paris AI Summit, which you were at. And
yes.
he was quite explicit, right? That they don't want other countries touching this sector.
The Trump administration is troubled by reports that some foreign governments are considering tightening the screws on U.S. tech companies with international footprints. Now, America cannot and will not accept that.
What was your reaction to that speech?
I think that it was so the night before at the LSA Palace, there had been a dinner and Vice President Vance was there as well. And
which you spoke at,
President
right?
Macron, yes, and that President Macron hosted. And that was a bit more, the vice president didn't speak there. So I think people didn't kind of quite know how he was going to position himself the next morning at this speech. And I think people were a bit put off. And I was, I think a bit amused, but not surprised, but that one comes to an international AI summit to say that you don't think any kind of international conversation on AI is useful, right? And so it is a kind of weird thing to go to the sort of an international table and sort of say we don't need international tables.
What did you say at the dinner the night before incident? What did he hear you say?
I had an opportunity to speak to a small community of world leaders, and I think wanted them to hear that the things that they are promising, that were being promised by technology companies, and that the governments are in turn promising to their constituencies, are not inevitabilities of the technology. So putting a chatbot in a classroom does not equal, enriched education. And that all of the things that we might hope for or not hope for, or be concerned about, really actually take leadership. It takes the leadership of people in that room to be willing to give shape to the kind of outcomes. Like none of these things are inevitable. I also said that that we should really think about the function of AI as being a service to people, a service to humanity, and not, an inefficiency for, a few people.
So I want to shift gears a little bit back to Canada. We're in a fairly unique moment in a sense that we are incredibly reliant on our relationship with the United States. We are going through a bit of a rupture, as our Prime Minister says, in that relationship. At the same time as we're trying to grow and scale our AI sector, and the government's coming up with a national AI strategy that's supposed to be launched in the next month or so. So they are literally adjudicating this position right now. What would you say to the government about a rights-based approach? Like, what have you learned from that experience in the Biden administration in sense that we should be taking on board when we think about this broad AI strategy, not just from a safety perspective, but more broadly?
So putting on my Canadian hat, I would say that there's a story about advanced artificial intelligence that's a Canadian story. And I don't hear Canadians telling that story. That's the story of Mila and Yoshua Bengio. That's the story of CFAR, the Canadian, Research Foundation, which was funding, Yoshua and Jan LeCun and Jeff Hinton, right? And so I guess I would bring us back to that as a kind of originary moment about Canada's capability in this space. And, I don't know how you turn those into national champions or whatever, but so I would say that. And I would also say, on the day that we're speaking, Taylor, it's the day that the second version issue of the International AI Safety Reports come out. So it's just come out this morning, a few hours ago. And I think what I was really pleased about with this second report, the second iteration of the safety report, is that it is about new capabilities and advanced capabilities, but very much remains anchored and rooted in sort of human beings and human well-being. And so I would just say that there is a way that you can both be, very bullish about the potentials of these technologies, and also have, I think, a very common sense. What I see in the polling in the United States, and I think some of the Canadian polling is consistent from the public, is that people just want common sense guardrails on these technologies, right? Like, a 14-year-old should not be able to use this technology such that it causes them to harm itself, right? We should not be able to circulate pornographic images or, enhance them, et cetera. These should not be used for wide-scale fraud or, cause cybersecurity risk, et cetera. So I think I would say to Canada that the rights-based approach to AI is simply an approach that values the rights that you already hold dear, and says that AI must also abide them. So a
walk through some of those with us. So what made up the Bill of Rights?
So the AI Bill of Rights, so I'll tell you about the process. So we consulted the public for almost a year. We had an op-ed in Wired magazine that had an email address to the White House that you could write to and weigh in. We had town halls. So we did a lot of public communication. And what we released in October of 2022, a month before ChatGPT, said 5 things, right? That AI systems should be safe and effective. I mean, that is like not a radical proposition, and we are really still trying to get there.
And the
really
public believes that too. I mean,
yes, right? Fundamental thing. We have more regulations for a toaster or for, an F-150 truck than you have for AI, right? Like, do we have just basic consumer protections around AI? No, not really. That you should know when AI tools are being used for consequential decisions. So should we have guardrails around whether or not AI is being used for Spotify or Netflix? No. Does anybody care? They might not like what the AI is suggesting that they watch tonight, but that's not a consequential decision. But if it's about something important in your life, your children's access to healthcare, whether or not you can get a mortgage to get a home, if AI was used to render that decision, knowing what we know about the tools that we use right now and their inherent inconsistencies and sometimes unreliability, you should know that it was being used. Should you have some modicum to some right to privacy? Yes, basic stuff. If an AI is being used for consequential decision, should you have some recourse? Like, should you be able to do something other than go to the AI equivalent of a phone tree in which you keep pressing 0 and hoping to get to someone and you just get a chatbot saying, the decision's been rendered, the decision's been rendered. Should there be protections against algorithmic discrimination or algorithmic bias? Yes. So those are the 5 AI Bill of Rights. And as I mentioned to you, that came out of a Democratic Party White House, but have also been taken up now by a Florida governor, Republican, and legislator. I mean, we call it rights-based because it invokes some rights and mentions rights, but in many cases, these are things that are already the law of the land. And so I think for policymakers and also for the public, if we can be slightly disenchanted with AI and shake ourselves from this sense that there's something so new that no policy or norm or law we could ever created could apply to them, we can actually imagine that the laws that we have, consumer protection law, do quite apply to chatbots, for example.
What does it tell us that both Biden and DeSantis are willing to adopt in a rights-based framework?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I mean, I think we know already that we're in this interesting political moment, certainly in the United States, of both, left and right populism kind of finding each other. So I think there's that. Sometimes rights get shunted off as if they are, the special concern of kind of women and, Black and brown people or something, as opposed to being the most universal of all things, right? That we all have rights that should be abided. And so I take heart by the fact that, Governor DeSantis sort of said, yeah, I mean, there are kind of fundamental basic rights here that should be abided, and that this rights framework is an efficacious one for the things that I'm trying to advance in my state to make AI safer and more responsible.
I'm trying to get a sense of the scope of applicability of those 5 rights. And one of the things that's quite prominent in our discourse now is the way surveillance technologies are being used in the US. And some Canadian surveillance technologies are being acquired or purchased or used by ICE. And I'm sure was thinking through how that rights framework applies to some of those debates we're having right now. And I'm wondering if does it cover the use of technology for illiberal ends or the technology itself?
I think that we have to, my personal philosophy as a policymaker is that you have to think about the use cases, because certainly with generative AI, you are dealing with something that's at least a dual use technology that has both, militaristic, national security implications, as well as kind of commercial consumer implications. So I do think the focus has to be on the uses. So I would just say that. In the case of ICE and surveillance technologies in particular, the challenge with rights in a time when laws and regulation is being broken is that, it becomes much harder to ensure that that's the case. So in the US context, as myself and others were watching the work of DOGE in the early days, I mean, part of our concern that was borne out was this. I mean, in order to protect against Big Brother coming out of the Watergate years in the United States, we have the Privacy Act of 1974. And among the things that Privacy Act does is sort of stipulate that various agencies in the United States government can't just share data about the American public with each other, right? That there are firewalls, and that if, in my time in government, if, I don't know, the IRS wanted to share data with the Census Bureau, the inspector generals of those offices would have to have a memorandum of understanding about why that data was going to be shared, have some way of ensuring that people's privacy would be protected, and then having, if applicable, a way to dispense of the data. So the agency just couldn't sit on top of the data. So all of those infrastructures were in place. And then you get DOGE, that basically came in, and as we understand from the excellent reporting from Wired and other places, just hoovered up all of the data and kind of put it in all of the cache together. So that's a violation of the Privacy Act. So it has broken the law. It has violated people's rights. But, the horse is out of the barn. And I think that those data combined together, sort of used in ways they weren't intended to be used together, in addition to the fact that it has been the case that I think agencies like DHS have been able to use data brokers, right? So American data, Canadian data, any of this data that's sold in the marketplace that comes from pings of your cell phone, comes from grocery shopping, anywhere that you're sort of are leaving a digital marker in the world. I believe it was the case that federal law enforcement authorities were not able to use those in its work, or were very constrained in doing so. What's now happened with ICE is that I think they've been sort of set free to use all of that data. So there's no constraint on that. And, the surveillance implications are horrifying. I mean, we've seen from some of the photojournalism, there's a horrifying photo that you might be familiar with, Taylor, of I don't know if it's ICE or CBP officer just going up to someone in the street and putting the camera in their face.
It's not illegal to record.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, why are you taking my information down?
Because we have a nice little database.
Oh, good.
So if you watch some of the interaction videos, they're holding their cell phones up to the face of people not knowing whether or not they're citizens or not citizens, because I think, working with Palantir and others, we just really do have Big Brother. We have a large cache of facial recognition technology
using
data that's being
Clearview.
used every day. Clearview as well. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So when Palantir's an interesting case here, because it seems like they're use cases are embedded in ICE for sure, but they're also working in adjacent areas inside government institutions around the world in ways that
National Health Service in the UK.
Sure, like governments have
Yeah.
democratic governments have decided are beneficial to their society, rightly or wrongly, right? But these are not necessarily illiberal decisions. But when Palantir does something like uses AI to sort through tips that have been sent into ICE, that is something we would have done anyway, right? But it's maybe turbocharging the capacity to consume tips, right? And is that
Right.
new?
That's the turbocharge is new. So I think just having a company that has the capability to help you clean, organize, and analyze in some way your company's data, your organization's data is probably fine if it is abiding, what people signed on to when they provided their data. So if you're not violating that, right?
Which is probably not the case in
Yes.
in
Yes.
many use cases there. Yeah.
But AI does supercharge that, and it makes possible, I think, finding associations, linkages, which may or may not be true, right? Associations that in certain contexts put people in their rights in jeopardy. And so I think that's when we need to be careful. I mean, my thinking about this is, can we think about AI and rights as a kind of set of concentric circles? And to the extent that it's not about my livelihood, my healthcare, my privacy, my family, maybe I don't really care. But certainly when it's about using data to track people, to surveil them, I think the rights thing is important. And I guess the question like you're asking, I would just say back to you, I do hear you, is that in the US context, because we're living under it now, whether or not you have the rights, if people are not going to abide them, you've got a problem.
There's a limit, right?
There's a
Right,
limit. There's a limit.
right.
So you can try all the things as folks are doing, going to court,
Yeah.
seeking injunctions,
Yeah.
maybe advancing new legislation. But I think for me, as a researcher, scholar, policy advisor, I think also one of the things that we can do that we're not doing enough of is just the question of reframing. That just because we have Opus 4.5, GPT-5 does not change the human values and rights regime, even though we're being told that it does.
I mean, one of your most recent advisory roles has been to the new mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani. How is he thinking about AI?
I am really hopeful that there's going to be some very interesting, I think, AI policy happening in New York City. I mean, for one, as an assembly member in the New York State Assembly, Assembly member Mamdani sort of supported progressive technology policy. So he supported something called the Stop Fakes Act to curb kind of government deception, the use of deception online by the government. He supported things like Connect All, which were initiatives to expand broadband access to residents in New York City and New York State, including those who were living in temporary housing, who maybe were sort of unhoused or vulnerable in the housing space. He had been a supporter for something called a Data Bill of Rights that was supposed to be seeking alternatives to surveillance technology and advancing responsible data sharing in New York City. So there's that. So I would say he has
So there are municipal levers that could be used here that are meaningful.
There are municipal levers that could be used.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that there are, to your point, Taylor, about levers, New York City has, and New York State have regulations on algorithmic pricing that you should know if their algorithmic pricing is being used to determine a price for you. So what I think is hopeful is that this mayor has I think the instincts and also the sort of the groundwork of guardrails that actually means that if the administration wants to advance interesting uses of AI that are privacy preserving, that are not surveillant, that they can do so, right? So I think, this was the philosophy of the Biden administration. It's like, have some guardrails so then you can actually really
then you can
do some
build and
things.
adopt
Yeah.
actually meaningfully. Yeah.
So now, so I think that I will say one thing that was interesting, this was in the news about, I think it was last week actually, is there's a big budget cut, no surprise, in New York City, as there are in a lot of cities and states. It's, somewhere between $8 and $12 billion. And so he's looking for savings. Where could we be better stewards of taxpayer dollars? And, identified this chatbot called the NYC chatbot that Eric Adams, the former mayor, had set up that was literally dispensing wrong information. It was dispensing illegal information. It was dispensing information to tenants, telling them how they could get their rights violated. It was telling landlords advising them how to violate the rights of tenants. So I think that's on the chopping block, that contract. Also he has the ability to bring in good AI to the extent there's good AI to be used for governance and to improve service and delivery and get rid of stuff that's just making it worse.
You mentioned progressive tech policy a moment ago, and there does seem like there's a new rhetoric emerging, certainly on the more populist left in the United States, and we're starting to see it in Canada too. I mean, Bernie Sanders has been very aggressive against the tech sector and certain AI companies in particular, and Mamdani's kind of replicated a bit of that rhetoric. Do you see that movement taking hold, and what do you think it would mean for that view of the tech sector to come into tension potentially with the sort of more moderate, democratic, maybe abundance view of technology, or more of, is there a tension there? And
I don't know that there's a tension. I think your leader, Carney said it's a rupture, this moment. There's certainly a realignment. I think we've seen with the recent gubernatorial elections in the United States, a real concern about the stakes and the cost of data centers, electricity prices, harms to the environment and the like. So I think that there is, I said progressive tax policy, but I think it's probably converging on something, as I said, I'll use this word again, like sort of common sense tech policy. Like in the state of New Jersey, should it be the case that my electricity goes up 25%, which has happened in the state of New Jersey, because you want to build more tech, data centers? And I think there's been a responsiveness to this, because you now hear President Trump saying, if the technology companies want to build more data centers, they're going to have to figure out how to pay for it. It can't cost people, right? So there's been a shift there. Even, we talked a little bit about Vice President Vance's speech in Paris. One of the things he said was that people shouldn't be wringing their hands about safety, right? That was a phrase, almost a verbatim phrase. And now we have a Trump administration, Michael Kratsios, who's the leader of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I used to work, now saying, well, we really need to, and I think it's even in the president's executive order, actually, we really need to pay attention to what's happening with work and workers, and we really need to pay attention to what's happening with our young people. So I think to the extent that we might want to say something is, the progressive tech policy piece, it would be about the consolidation of power in big tech, right? These 5 or 6 or 7 companies that our fates rest in their rise and fall in some regard, and that we are told that we have no control over that. So I think that's certainly where there's a divergence, that to the extent that people are willing to really draw a bright line around the power of the companies and how to constrain that power.
Just to close here, I certainly personally, and in part through talking to a lot of people in the show and the work we do, both with the government and the research space here, somewhat disillusioned about the place we're in with this technology. You're right, there's a lot of hopeful use cases, but I do feel like we're heading in a very particular direction. And I wonder how you view that trajectory and the uncertainty. And I know among the many hats you wear, you're an Afrofuturist. And I'm wondering if that brings you a different lens on this and how you bring that thinking into your view of this sort of moment of uncertainty.
Thank you for that question. Yes, it's a really important frame for the work, because it is, so what you hear, I think, is hope is actually not as hopeful as I think it sounds, as I sound. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, what Afrofuturism allows is a real reckoning with the fact that communities, my communities that look like mine, are often at the front end of the most repressive and surveillant uses of technology, and also have come out of a tradition of people who continue to seek rights, continue to seek a world in which that's more humane, and that everybody's humanity is sort of honored and respected. So I think what what might sound like hope is actually, I think, a long view of having seen these technologies and similar technologies been used for harm, and insisting on reframing how we think about them, insisting on reframing how they might be possibly used, imagining another way that they might be possibly used, and just staying persistent in that conversation and that struggle.
Is there a guiding principle there that can that can serve as a sort of North Star for all of us as we move into this pretty uncertain place?
I think, the guiding light is that we have, in so many ways, many of our communities have been at a place like this in which we felt that the powers were around us were stronger, more powerful, more consolidated than anything that we could possibly do. It is literally biblical, right? David and Goliath, if you go back to that. And so sometimes, David wins. And I think that's what keeps me in the work. And what I've come to love about policymaking, I think, are those David moments, even in a place like the White House, where you are trying to think about what's an innovative way around or through this particular policy space that offers more benefit to more people.
Well, look, thanks for the work you're doing and for talking to us about it. And I hope we can get you to Canada sometime soon to help us through this transition as well.
Well, thank you for the conversation. I'm a big fan of the work that you do and grateful to be here.
Thanks so much. Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. Our executive producer is James Millward. Special thanks to Angela Pacenza and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really does help us get the show to as many people as possible. Machines Like Us is supported by the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Learn more at mcgill.ca/maxbellschool. Machines Like Us is also supported by CFAR, a global research organization based in Canada. Explore their work at cfar.ca.